know if you guys can read that.
Fantastic. It's fantastic.
Is that a decent view, Zoom people? Do you have a link or anything that people might wanna look at? No?
No.
Okay, it's okay. Just wondering, because if you did, I'd share it.
I will note that for future reference, so it'll be easier to.
Usually.
Zoom people, can you read what he's saying, or is it backwards?
You're all muted, so. That's thumbs up.
Well, when he gets done writing, he'll stand away from the whiteboard and they'll see the whiteboard.
Yeah.
Can you see his back?
Possibility of success, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one
That seems to be the problem in the Ukraine.
What? Yeah.
no, I'll get to that.
Yeah, we're working on it.
It's at least it's a question.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this is something we need to talk about. It's
What does that mean?
it's gonna come up a lot.
Jus ad bellum is it just to go to war, and jus
Yeah.
in bello is
How you
justice
operate.
in war.
or how you operate, the law of its operation.
So once you're fighting, you're still ruled by rules.
Yeah, you have to follow certain rules.
Jus is for justice, or right, or,
Use is justice.
yeah. We get the word jury from it.
Oh, okay.
Jus juris.
Yeah, I actually learned something this morning when I was trying to work through some of this stuff. I came across a little video. When we say it is right and just,
Yeah.
I always wondered, how would that be translated from Latin? It's dignum.
Use
Yeah, yeah.
Dignity.
Fitting,
Right.
fitting and
Because I was always like,
equal.
right and just, with justice, that doesn't, but yeah, it's dignity, so I thought that was.
So the base meaning of justice is
Dignum,
equal,
used
so
to.
it's
Yeah.
fitting and equal.
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever.
I mean, it's not wrong to translate as just, it's just that equal is more base meaning of just. You can apply it to all forms of justice, kind of equality,
Kind of, yeah.
proportionate or otherwise.
So, all right. Let me know when you're ready. Good.
I'm ready.
All right. Can they read this?
Oh, I got I can read it okay.
Okay, that's
So that's the only person who responded. So
because I will be writing something else up later.
Fit.
So,
Fits the situation.
because for us it's backwards. Like
Oh, I turn off mirror.
I don't know.
There's a button under.
But for the teachers, the Zoomers are able to read, so it doesn't even matter. You don't have to read this.
If it's showing backwards to us, it's showing backwards to them.
Oh, really?
Click, if the letters are backwards, click the video settings and click turn off mirror. Video settings is the bottom. Then there's a thing mirror my video.
Is that better?
Now you can read it, right?
Yeah,
Then they can read it.
I can read it.
Yeah, that means they can read it.
yeah.
Okay.
Now right is on the right instead of on the left.
So now it's see-through instead of mirrored.
All right.
So it shows up as you want it to, as opposed to backwards.
Okay.
You
I'm
still
just
got,
gonna,
you still got
I'm just
glare.
gonna send them
I just know
forward.
this because of cello
I'm
lessons,
just
you know,
gonna-
and you're trying to show them the music and it doesn't work if
oh, there's
it's
sort of
mirrored.
a table there behind you.
Okay. Just blurry, not backwards.
Mirrored is nice because when you move your arm this way, your arm moves that way. See-through, it does
I
the
know.
opposite, but
Okay.
yeah,
Going.
if you're reading, you don't want mirrored.
All right. So, talking about sort of entering into the new document of what is it, Dignitas Infinitum, or whatever that is, infinite dignity, but particularly through the lens of just war theory.
The war section.
Right, because paragraphs 38 and 39 of the new document talk about war in particular.
Are these really long paragraphs?
No.
No, they're very short paragraphs,
Short.
Oh, it should.
but we'll get to couching in the terminology and stuff.
But it's
So-
important for him to go over this first so that we
Sure,
can
of course,
discuss.
yeah.
Right. So, just war theory, classically, you have, it's developed over time, right? So, these first three, this is justice in going to war, justice toward war, versus sort of justice in war, jus in bello and jus ad bellum. Those are the sort of the classical categories they've been categorized in, right? Aquinas discusses this in Secunda, question 40, right? War. And he relies heavily on Augustine. He quotes Augustine all over the place. The first three, legitimate authority, a just cause, and the right intention, these are explicit from Aquinas. He lists these three out. You have to have a legitimate authority. The individual can't declare war on a nation. He doesn't have the authority to do so. I can't declare war on Canada. The mayor can't declare war on France. It doesn't work that way. So you have to have a legitimate authority. You have to have a just cause. So you have to have a just cause. There has to be some notion of justice involved. Right? This gets sort of refined later, and almost always put in the terms of the unjust aggressor, and it becomes very defensive sounding. Right? You'll often see this put as the only defensible war is a war of defense.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that's the way it's very often put. That's not the way you see it in Aquinas in particular. And there are reasons for that, and you can think of it, I'll put it this way. If you have a man walking down the street, and he sees another man accosting some woman inside. You don't just walk on by, right? You step in. That's not necessarily, and if you have a nation, whether that's a man or a nation, you have the same issue. You can't just stand by while the other nation does such things. So that's why you don't see that in Aquinas' writings. Because there are issues of justice where you may need to step in that is not necessarily one of just defense.
You'd be defending somebody else.
Right.
Right.
So,
That's where you see all these
Defending
leagues,
justice.
right? People make alliances. If I get attacked, that's,
by this company, yeah, you get that, that's a direct alliance.
yeah.
You also get the notion of, part of the issue there comes with legitimate authority. Who's the legitimate authority with international affairs, right? When you're looking at the world of Aquinas, right, you had, in particular, you're going to have two major figures in the history of like Christendom. You're going to have the Pope as an international authority, and you're going to have like the Holy Roman Emperor who has some international authority, right? The international authority of those figures has been, in a way, greatly reduced, right? You don't have the Holy Roman Emperor
At
anymore.
all, yeah.
Interesting enough, when the last of that line gets dispersed, you have World War I, right?
Yeah.
So, that's also one of the things you see being called for, particularly after World War II. You'll see that in a lot of magisterial documents going forward, the need for some form of international authority, right? It's emphasized. Right, so the just cause, like I was saying, tends to be put in defensive terms, but realistically speaking, that's not the entirety of it, right? Rwanda is a good case of that. You just stand by while you watch these people kill each other? You shouldn't.
The Pol Pot,
Right? Killing
Cambodia.
fields in Cambodia, that sort of thing. You shouldn't just stand by. Right intention. You have, even if you have a just cause, you have to go in there for the right reason,
Yeah.
right?
I'm gonna get rich.
Yeah. Yeah. So the notion of a military-industrial complex, you can't be going in there to make money to build your giant machine. None of that.
It's when the Christians sacked Constantinople on the way to
Yeah, you can't be doing that.
Jerusalem.
Right. There has to be proportionality. These two here aren't specifically mentioned. These are later sort of developments in a sense. but they're not against any of what Aquinas is talking about here.
I think they kind of fall under just cause.
Yeah, well, see, the legitimate authority has to make a prudential decision, and these things are because he mentions that the authority is making a prudential decision. These are things we're taking into consideration in your prudential decision to go to war.
It's not just even, if it's partly just, it's not just, it has to be all the way just.
So the proportionality, you're going to war. This is going to cause a lot of devastation. There has to be a proportion for you to do that, some sort of proportionality. You can't go to war and say, well, you know, Trudeau has made everybody in Canada wear T-shirts saying "I love Trudeau." That is not a good enough reason to go, you know, feel like. Right? And proportionality is also mentioned in use in bello. So in that situation, you can't say, well, the proper proper response is to, you know, nuke Quebec or something, right? So there has to be proportion both in what you're doing and the reason you're going, right? There has to be a possibility of success. This I find interesting because I can think of, in a sense, a possible way of looking at this where that might not be always the case to put it in those terms. Because it depends on what you mean by success.
Yes.
And the reason I state that is because there are situations where you have the notion of a heroic last stand, and we all recognize those as being heroic. And that's true in the case of an individual or in the case of a battle, right? So you can think within recent history, you could look at what's often called the Polish Thermopylae, the Battle of Wisna, right? Where you have like anywhere between 300 and 750 soldiers sitting out there, holding off 40,000 German troops, knowing every single one of them is not going to get out of there. They know it's a doomed battle. But they're not doing it to win the battle. They're doing it to buy other people time.
Right.
And so if you could do that on an individual level, you can see that on a battle. I see no reason why there wouldn't be a possibility even on a national level for the nation to stand and fight and die if there's sufficient reason for doing so.
You can see that. I remember talking at one of the Idaho men's conferences with a guy who had been at Vietnam, and I was asking, well, it seems like, you know, we went in without trying to win and all this kind of stuff, and he said, yeah, but it stopped communism. So it didn't stop it in Vietnam, but it stopped it in a lot of other places.
Right. Never went to Thailand, right? Never
So
went
you
to,
can
never
have
went to Malaysia.
No, now I think we did have possibility of success and that we blew it, but but even given that we couldn't have won in Vietnam, it still had success in terms of the Monroe Doctrine.
John, you had a question?
Yeah, the question is use the term possibility, thank you. What about probability? I mean, but I think you've helped me understand by saying somebody stands up and says, I'm going to do everything I can. And there is possibility of success in that chance, but probability, seems like in a policy-making area, you'd want a probability of success when you're sitting down evaluating the just war theory.
The link, right, well, comes from that prudential decision. So I just put possibility of success.
Well, does St. Augustine use possibility?
He doesn't mention
Oh, that's right.
These aren't mentioned by
But
him.
in the modern writing.
Right, so it depends, right? So if, I've heard this put as possibility, I've heard it put as probability, and I've even heard it put it as hope, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like there's a necessarily definitive. You
It's
probably
not a
need to
math
look.
equation?
Yeah, it's not. It's part of this prudential decision.
Well, it seems to me, and I don't want to waste time on this, but it seems like the discussion of probability would be as a council of policymakers sitting with the king or with the president, weighing the possibility of success.
Yeah.
They would want a probability before they committed men. That's a different analysis than the council of those on the battlefield saying, we've got to do this, we have this possibility of success. Does that make sense?
Well, you know how our...
Wait, he's thinking,
I'm just,
I just want to address that. I like your reflection.
yeah, the issue is I'd have to look up at the term the catechism uses. But to be honest with you, I think in terms of policy, it really is a prudential decision. So,
Gotcha.
so the people
I
in
can make that
charge,
connection.
yeah, the people in charge have to decide, is this a good enough, is it probable enough which is the best way, how do we go about this?
Yeah.
And you have to have, what they're saying is you have to figure out what your goal is, right? And if you can't achieve that goal at all, right? Now, if it's, this gets to that proportionality. If the possibility of success is so low proportionally, it's a prudential decision.
Yeah.
You see our Lord talks about this in the parable. He says, if you have a army of 10,000 and the king far away is coming with 20,000, you have to decide whether or not you can defeat the 20,000 with the 10. If you cannot, you send out ambassadors while he's still far away.
Sue for peace, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so that's the idea, that's,
Yeah.
right? So it does come down to prudence, he has to figure, right? And maybe he does it with consulting people that are wise in war and so on, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's very much the notions of the prudential decision. The use in bello is what we're doing, because the moral law doesn't stop when you, like, oh, we've declared war, everything's on the table. It turns out not all is fair in love and war. The discussion on that, yeah, I mean, that's really been a discussion all the way back in literature, the Iliad, right? Love and war, everywhere in that. So the notions here is proportionality, again, proportionality of means, right? Like I said, you can't just like, well, we're going to war against Canada, we'll start dropping the nukes tomorrow because, you know, we can. No, it doesn't work that way. Right? So even if you have, a just cause, you're going in for the right reasons, you have to do so in a proportional manner. The other thing is discrimination. That means discrimination in your targeting. You can't target non-combatants, right? You can't. So there's all sorts of rules. You got the entire Geneva Convention working on this sort of stuff. You can't use certain things, right? No gassing the guys. All right. We can't do those sorts of things. No torturing people. Do you have something?
So, and then under discrimination, you know, it's become a common tactic to hide your combatants among civilians in a lot of, in a lot of places, like, in Gaza, for instance, but.
That seems to be a tactic of terrorists, right?
Right, yeah. How do we manage to discriminate when we need to fight against the people who are hiding among civilians? What is
This, right, this gets to the actual, some of the thinking you're gonna see behind, the paragraphs 38 and 39 of Dignitas Infinita, Infinita, or whatever it
It
is.
seems to be frozen.
infinite dignity, or, yeah.
Yeah, infinite dignity.
Reviewing it.
That gets to some of the questions. So like I said, it's 2 paragraphs.
Well, according to the laws of war right now, it's a war crime on the part of the combatants who hide among the civilians.
Right,
That's what the current law is
right.
internationally.
They're committing a war crime. I'm trying to fight them. They're hiding among civilians. What am I supposed to do?
Well, I wish they had an answer for you. Their answer seems to be like the Dignitas Infinita. They reiterate, it's very short, because this is not something, if I was going to condense it all into sort of one thing, it's basically, when we ask if a war is just, really what we should do is just table that whole discussion of the just war theory, table it, and instead we should ask ourselves, how do we avoid the war? Right? Although the Catechism flat out states this has to be the last possible option. Right? How do we avoid the war? And failing that, just how do we get out of the war we're stuck in? Right? It doesn't specifically, and part of the reason it does this is because of things like, there's really, the people we're fighting against have generally, you're going to end up fighting people who are not going to be, just in war. This isn't people who have the same sorts of concepts. You're going to lose proportionality. You're going to have all sorts of problems. People are going to die, and they're going to die in horrible ways. Given modern warfare and the way it is being fought, you're gonna lose these, and so we should just table the whole discussion. That's kind of the idea, it seems to be put forward.
That's in the document?
This is my sort of
Reading of the document.
reading of the document, right? He says we should avoid the logic of legitimacy, right? So, which is saying we should table the topic, right? We should avoid it, right?
Well,
Yes?
just a quick point is I think part of the discussion when you were using Israel and Hamas, they both come from the tradition of the lex talionis, which is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and their analysis is not going to follow this. The West looks at it and applies these standards, but Israel is going to look at it as an eye for an eye, or at least they're going to propose it.
Right, now.
I don't want to,
Yeah.
don't want to divert the discussion, I just want that as, yes, because I want to get into this discussion as to this infantatis humani, or whatever, dignitatis, right?
Right, so I do, one of the reasons I started getting into philosophy in the first place is because I wanted to understand how other people think, right? I did not want to sort of straw man these people's positions or I wanted to try to understand where they're coming from and do so in a charitable fashion, right? So digging around, you're going to see, here, I think this will go to the notion of justice and within, not just within war, but in other concepts as well. This helps give light on the situation, because when you're talking about war, you're looking at some form of justice, right? And there's from a general audience, Pope Francis, Wednesday, February 3rd, 2016. If we think of the legal administration of justice, we see that those who consider themselves victims of injustice turn to a judge in a tribunal and ask that justice be done. It is retributive justice which inflicts a penalty on the guilty party according to the principle that each person must be given his or her due. He then quotes where you get that from a couple places from Scripture, and then he goes on. This path, however, does not lead to true justice because in reality it does not conquer evil, it merely checks it. Now, so that is sort of the mind of Francis on the notion of justice, okay? And what he wants to do here is he wants to point out, like, rather than just addressing the justice issue, we want to go past that and try to give the person, or in this case the nation, the ability to understand their own dignity, or allow them that opportunity,
So that the priest comes into the courtroom.
so that they can then address their own actions. Because this is predicated, this entire notion of where they're coming from is predicated on a sort of reframing of the moral of the moral system, right? So you would have the ontological dignity of man, because they're putting everything in terms of human dignity and human rights. Okay? This is sort of the framework they're using. And you've seen this framework shift if you've read the documents since even before the council, but particularly from the council forward, right? You see the sort of shifting of the language into human rights and human dignity talk. Okay? Let me grab my phone and I'll read you something.
You see it in the Declaration, right? They use the word rights.
And you will find.
The Zoom totally froze. That's what I'm doing. I'm not ignoring you.
If you look at the, like in the document, it points out the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It was released on the 75th, in response to the 75th anniversary of that. This is from,
It's not the ancient way of talking.
no, it's a
The word
different.
right was never used back in the time of, say, Augustine and.
Right, but here, the Dignity and Rights of the Human Person, International Theological Commission from 1983, 3.22, Proposal for a Common and Universal Observance of Human Rights. if you've read Fratelli Tutti, which I did when it came out, and it uses the term infinite dignity in there as well. In Fratelli Tutti, yeah. And it uses the same sort of framework, the framework of human rights and human dignity. Okay, 3.22, proposal for a common and universal observance of human rights. We've seen that in today's world there's a reasonably general consensus on the normative moral value of the rights of man. It is also clear that there is a considerable disagreement when discussion is centered on philosophical justification, juridical interpretation, or political possibilities where the rights of man are concerned. As a result, there is much ambiguity in this field. In practice, we frequently meet injustices and violations of the freedom of the person. This granted, today in the matter of realization of the rights of man, we should note what follows. This is sort of the key phrase that I think I will contrast later with a quote from Aquinas where you see some of this tension. The key phrase here, since the value of human dignity makes it the highest good to be pursued in the moral order and the basis of juridical obligation, human rights must be clearly defined and giving juridical expression. The possibility of applying those fundamental rights in this way will depend on achieving a consensus that transcends differing philosophical and sociological conceptions of man. Should such a consensus be arrived at, it will serve as a basis for common interpretation of the rights of men, at least in the political and social fields. Such a basis is to be found in that triad of fundamental principles, namely liberty, equality, and participation. This triad underlies the rights attached to personal liberty, juridical equality, and the exercise of the activities belonging to social, economic, cultural, and political life. The links that exist between the elements of this triad exclude a one-sided interpretation, liberalistic, functionalistic, collectivistic. All nations, then, in putting these fundamental rights into practice, should see to it that the elementary conditions for a dignified and free life exist. In such a matter, it will, of course, be necessary to keep in mind the special conditions of each nation from the point of view of culture and social and political life. Once the fundamental rights have been defined, they should be written into the Constitution and everywhere given juridical sanction. It would be impossible to have the rights of man fully and universally acknowledged and reduced to practice unless all states, especially in the case of conflicts, recognize the jurisdiction of some international institution and refrain from using absolute power in the matter. To reach, indeed, this international juridical consensus, it will be necessary, in a methodical way, to set aside old ideological conflicts and also the narrower conception of ways of living that distinguish certain communities. In the same way, in the family of nations, each and every citizen should treasure these fundamental rights and cultivate the values that sustain them. Now, in Dignitas Infinita, there is a fourfold sort of distinctions on human dignity. Ontological dignity, moral dignity, social dignity, and existential dignity. The issues, right? So this is sort of the framework that they're coming out of with all of this strange language. And the problem, there are some problems. One of the problems is, of course, how does this map on to the old teaching? We don't have a sort of correspondence language, right? There are going to be all sorts of issues doing that because you can't violate something that was said. So we need to be able to correspond what you're saying to what was said. Right? So, and a lot of this stuff just is not clarified. Different relationships between some of the language they use. Like, what's the difference between an affront to, contrary to, or an attack on human dignity? Right? What's the relationship between those sorts of categories and sin? Right? Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm stepping in late. Did they define the terms in the document?
Oh, ontological dignity? Yes, that's defined. Okay, it is defined, and rightly so, it's defined as being rooted in man as the image of God, right?
But did they define any of the terms that are not analogous to the previous teachings of the church?
No, they don't go into that.
Okay.
Right.
So we have to assume, unfortunately, what they may mean based on our own perception of what we're reading, right?
Yes, this is part of the problem. I mean, I wrote down, if I was going to try and sort of give an argument in this case, it'd be something like,
respecting and disrespecting ontological dignity is a human act unless a moral act, being an act between persons that falls to justice.
Oh, okay.
It does not state that anywhere, right? It does not state the notion of respecting or disrespecting human dignity in moral terms. That's one of the problems.
Did they define philosophy? Because it sounds to me like they're saying, we can make statements about things without having a philosophy, and our philosophy is not a philosophy, but everybody else's philosophy is a philosophy. And we have to ignore everybody else's philosophies, and everybody should, without calling what we're doing a philosophy, abide what we say.
I get that.
Well, what they're doing here is they're trying, as I read to the International Theological Commission, they're trying to get everyone on a particular page with a common basis, right?
But particularly by disregarding philosophies.
Oh, yeah. It's
So that would seem to include the perennial
What
philosophy.
do they call it now? The old.
The problem is you can't do that within the Catholic Church because you're going to end up calling into question, 2,000 years of teaching.
Well, there's that problem, but also the problem is that you actually have a philosophy that you're
I
promoting.
was just wondering.
Well, yeah, in doing so, you can't not perform a
Because when he
philosophy.
speaks theologically,
You have to,
it's
But
you
you-
can't not philosophize.
Got it. That makes
So-
sense.
And you can't put forward a notion of rights or dignity without some underlying philosophy.
And part of this philosophy is that it's whatever consensus is out there, that is what we should do.
Well, I'll get to my opinion on that in a minute, all right? So I'm going to go back to my sort of attempt to present the sort of notion
Sure.
in a way that's, from what I can tell, will at least be fair to them, right? Retributive justice is inadequate to the task of correction as it fails to convert the person from error to truth. Justice which takes the dignity of human persons in view would provide for directing the person towards conversion. It will allow for the person to recognize his own dignity that he may come to act in accord with. So the notion here is sort of almost an enforced charity.
Right here. Convert.
The conditions of war make it incompatible with prosecuting it without violating human dignity. If you're going to go to war, you're going to be violating some human dignity.
And a footnote here is that, I can't help but go there, but it's like the courtroom is a violation too. When a sentence is handed down to someone who has violated justice, unless the court takes the term, according to this, to change their mind, which is what courts don't do and have never done.
Right. Well, what is expecting justice systems worldwide and effectively to want to do, not just justice systems, but the notion of war, because that's what we're focused on here, is the idea that we...
I'm referencing back to the Pope's 2016 statement.
Yes,
And that's a philosophical that goes all the way back when they started calling prisons penitentiaries in the late 1700s. It's a concept that we can change man in this world and his human nature, and that is utter nonsense.
right. What he's saying is not that we can change human nature, but that we should provide the conditions that allow him to change.
Or the Department of Corrections.
Right. So this is basically one of the reasons why he sort of is adamantly opposed to the notion of the death penalty, is because it doesn't allow for the possibility of the conversion.
Well, I get that argument, but I'm talking about the courtroom or the effect.
The thing is from what he was saying, what he's saying is retributive justice, which is sort of the standard of justice,
Right.
to give each person their due, isn't enough, right? We need to sort of step it up and allow the person to return to
Not
his
that
own
it should be
dignity.
destroyed.
No,
It's just
I'm
not, we have to
saying-
go transcend that, is that what you're saying?
Right, but the problem is that's collapsing the order of charity and the order of justice.
Well, it's pushing them together, and
Enforcing,
one is
yeah.
opposed to the other. And this is where, looking at the language, we have 20 minutes, we have, the language of this is both good and very offensive. I'm talking about infinitus, I don't want to give it the dignity. But anyway, in other words, war, by this statement, seems to ignore human nature.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. what I'm saying is, what I'm trying to say here is that I think in a sense what he's wanting to do here is to try to open the space up for almost a notion of restructuring things in this view of rights and dignity, and by doing so, he wants to see, he's entire stress on mercy. That's really the notion, to step beyond and allow for the possibility of conversion.
But if you step over the line of human nature and into the line of philosophy and what we hope things do, utopia is your neighbor.
I'm not going to disagree with that, because you're doing, like I said, there are issues of nature and grace, the natural and the supernatural, justice and charity that are being not addressed properly.
And maybe I'm trying to say is, if you don't take into consideration human nature, communism did that, socialism does that, then you create a utopia and it's nonsense.
Right, that relates to something else I'll get to in just a minute. Yes.
Okay.
Does he reconcile or address the past actions of popes who led us into war? Because there have been popes that have led us into war.
Look, if you put Pope Urban II and Pope Francis, who is the one who preached the crusade, right? He's
Urban.
right? Urban II.
Yeah.
If you stuck him in a room with Pope Francis, I'm sure it would not be a polite conversation. Okay.
So there is no acknowledgement or reconciliation in terms of
When it-
justification or what is righteous or not
When it
righteous?
comes particularly to religion, he says religion and war are antithetical. Like I said, if you stuck him and Pope Urban II in the same room, there's going to be some theological discussions very quickly.
Now, that I agree with, by the way.
Well, see, the problem is then you have to go up against like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Crusades.
Well, what I'm saying is you cannot use religion as a motivation for war. And that's a distinct subject matter than a cause to go save the Holy Land from the Muslim horde. And how is because
I don't think Francis is going to see it as a...
But he didn't, in other words, he didn't address it or reconcile
No. Basically, like I
his
said,
position with that.
the intention when it comes to war in particular is to say war is bad, we want to table the discussion, and we want to get out of the just war doctrine as much as possible, because you can't do it rightly. You could not do it properly. Yes.
I want to look at it a little bit differently, like in the reality of where we are versus in the sphere of the ideas of how things should be looked at. And the idea of like, is there a just authority currently to have a just war?
Right, so Augustine is going to say, because Augustine is going to note that the proper authority, if you have a just cause and right intention, is another nation. The other nation may have a just cause, it's a brother correcting a brother, and that's what it should be, a brother nation correcting a brother nation. One of the differences we have in the modern world is Chesterton says somewhere that we used to say that a nation had sinned like a man. Now we say a nation is rotted like a cheese. Right? So, and that stuck out to me when I read it. That's why I remember it. Right? So that's part of it. So if you look at Augustine, he talks about the other nation. But if you look at it with Aquinas, in the world of Aquinas, you had the Pope as an international authority figure. You had the Holy Roman Emperor, who definitely had some international authority going on. So you had someone who could move in. And you had different. The feudal kingdom system was much different than the modern nation state system.
Yeah. So my question is, maybe if we looked at it from that perspective of like, okay, the authority situation has changed in the world, so does that mean that this is different?
This gets to one of the points. One of the things that has shifted, is the view of
This
the
might be
goal.
the question, John.
This is one of the things I was going to get to. One of the things that has shifted is the goal. So if you read Leo the 13th, right, and those popes, what you're going to see is a view of what we need to do is we need to sort of convert the people, thereby convert the nations and rebuild Christendom. Because once you have Catholic nations, you're gonna have a much better system. You're gonna have an international system of brothers, right?
Mhm.
This is what works. It worked for all the way up to the Protestant Reformation, right? This worked in some sense. And there are problems. There's always going to be problems. There's human beings. But it was a working system. So we need to rebuild something like that. It doesn't have to be that exactly. You don't have to have kingdoms. You could have republics, but you need Catholic nations. That has changed, right? The view has changed. What you see now is almost, it's the equivalent in a sense of the Treaty of Westphalia, right? It's very much we're not going to convert the nations. War is too nasty. We need something now. So what we're going to do is create some sort of consensus to work with to stop that sort of stuff.
Order.
We're going to have something like a League of Nations, a United Nations, an international authority of various, right? So a sort of pluralistic international commission in a sense. Which is why, and you can see that focus, you can see it in the documents, fraternity, liberty, fraternity, equality, fraternity, fratelli tutti.
Fratelli tutti.
Fratelli tutti talks about liberty, equality, fraternity, right? This is a notion, and in a way, it is just like the Treaty of Westphalia. It's making a concession to the other to avoid war.
Aren't those the words of the French Revolution?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It feels exactly.
So do you think that there is legitimate authority to have just war?
At the moment,
At the
yes.
moment.
At the moment,
Okay.
well, at the moment, there's a legitimate authority. Whether or not I would say there's someone who would be a just user of that authority is another question.
Right, that's my next one.
Right,
That
right,
was
right.
like my next, okay, so there is authority, are they
This-
acting justly in this authority? Like,
I-
so that's, I wanna go at it, like, try to think through his situation from like, what does he see in the
He-
real world and like, cause it seems like also with John Paul II, like he saw so much,
This is where you get a lot of, there's a lot of bad stuff, and you see it, particularly after World War II is where you get this
Yeah.
shift into this.
yeah,
Because they saw the horrors of war,
yeah.
and you have that as a huge influence on the notion that we can't wait to convert the nations. We have to find something that works in the meantime, because it's just that bad.
So we can't, it's, go ahead.
Well, and so like the next thing I think about is like, it's also not like a line of soldiers going against each other anymore. Like it's so much different.
You can no longer maintain a notion of proportionality in war.
That's the opinion.
Yes, it is. It is.
Because like cyber warfare, like there's so much that can be done to
Right,
civilians.
there is, but here's the thing. I read Don Quixote back in high school. I don't remember much, but I remember having an admiration for the ideals of the man in that story. That even though the world was crazy, he was going to live in a time and he was going to have a standard of right and justice, even if it was a lunatic standard, compared, literally just off the wall. But there was a sense of honor and nobility in that. So, yeah, the enemy may use unfair methods, but that doesn't mean we have to.
Well, I agree with that, but the fact that it would be considered just, I don't think that any of that would be considered just.
Right, so what I'm saying is we can act in a just and noble fashion, even if the opponent does not.
Right.
That will affect the possibility of success and the probability of it, yeah, because they're using tactics that are just,
Well, I mean, to make it more blunt, if you have a war, at least one side is unjust.
oh, yeah,
Yeah.
So
yes.
are they abdicating the authority for a just war solely to the state or in this document?
Not so much a state.
I mean,
not
a
just
state in
document.
terms of national.
Right, well, this is not just this document. You can see the call for an international authority in papal documents going back to John the 23rd. Documentarist mentions the notion of
Some-
international authority.
To
And
get
Benedict
specific, is
mentions
that,
it too.
yeah, are they no longer involved in that, in that process, and are they abdicating it? Is that
No.
what I'm hearing?
No, they're not totally abdicating it. Right now, what you have is sort of, like the Vatican is a permanent observer at the United Nations, right? So it's there, it's watching. So basically what it's looking at is some sort of effectively something like the United Nations, reformed, and with more teeth.
Well, they're going through that right now through the international, on the 27th of May, they're gonna be, Biden is signing the treaty for the World Health Organization to become a member of it. And allowing them to order us to tell us when the pandemic, and be able to order the police in the state of Idaho when to tell you what to do.
Yeah, that's because in the United
That's-
States, we can bind ourselves via treaty to other laws.
Well, this is not a treaty, this is gonna be an agreement. That's the good thing, because we can break it. The local magistrates and governors can say, this is not an international treaty, so therefore we don't have to obey it.
But it's a general problem, though.
But it's not, in other words, it's not a law of the land. But what I'm saying is the United States right now is moving in this direction to recognize an unelected, not responsible to anyone else entity to impose its will on our country.
I don't, like, there's nothing in sort of, in theory with having an international authority, as long as it follows the entire role of subsidiarity all the way up.
Yeah, I get that. What I'm saying is, this brings up, and what you've opened my mind to is to try to get to understand what the Pope is saying, whether it's very distasteful or it's very tasteful.
Right.
To me, what he's presenting is beyond distaste. But what you've opened me up to is the possibility. It's so distasteful that I have fallen back to just let him pass, let it go on, move on to the next situation and pray for him. That's where I'm at. But what thank God you're doing is opening up here, and what this did for me, this dignitatis, whatever, is say, okay, what are they really saying? And is there some truth in this?
There is some truth to it.
The thing is, I could support an international entity as long as it was responsible to the people, and the concept of subsidiarity. The guy at the top, who is he's African that does not have a very good record. And I would be able to want to depose him through due process of law and not have to obey it. And have a system of going after him, but we don't have that. They're just going to sign this treaty and allow him to tell us what to do if there's a pandemic.
The general problem is that you don't want to make one single state for the whole world. You want to really have sovereign states.
Yeah.
And whatever you put over those sovereign states, it's not a sovereign state. And otherwise you're reduced to having one sovereign state, right? So if it's not a sovereign state, it can't have the same kind of authority that the state has.
So it creates problem with the authority in terms of justice.
Right. Part of that is due to the modern nation state,
Right.
And the notion of sovereignty that we have today. So
Which came out of the Treaty of Westphalia.
Right.
Yeah.
If you go back before that, you have kingdoms, you have baronies, you have the feudal system.
Yeah.
And the feudal system has a very different notion. So there is a lot more subsidiarity within the feudal system than you have in the modern nation state, or the republic structure as we know it today.
The one thing that when you bring up the Treaty of Westphalia is because they restructured the order completely of the world in that treaty, and it was successful. So is there a possibility, that's what opens my mind to it, is to try to understand what he's saying is there a possibility of an arrangement that could be successful that
Think there is.
involved the Western mind? But the guy in whatever, name the country, in China, is not a Western mind. Neither is the guys in East Pakistan. They're not Western.
Right. The point is as I read that thing from the International Theological Commission, they think there is.
Well, so
I
far
think
they
there's a
haven't
bit.
successfully
Well, no,
explained.
that was written in the 80s. So, and like I said, that's
I'm
just,
talking about the Bishop of Rome has not explained it yet.
well,
Successfully.
it's been an ongoing project. Like I said, you could go back to Pacem and Terrace.
Yeah.
The notion
No,
of
I
international
know.
authority is, and the change of language to human rights and human dignity has been there, all along. So it's not like,
I
the
get
use
it.
of the language is sui generis, it's been there.
Didn't just pop up.
It didn't just pop up with him. Like I said, there are a lot of unspoken issues because this is the language that, It's a language which you can tie to Catholic notions. You can tie it. And you can use this language, but it's not the language we have been using, and we have no translation system, right? And so there are all sorts of, what's the difference between the infinite dignity of all human beings and the dignity of the baptized? How do we use that terminology there? How does the ontological dignity directly relate to the moral dignity? I said that it looks like disrespecting the ontological dignity would be a moral act, but it doesn't state that anymore, right? You know, and what about social dignity, existential dignity? How do those relate?
Yeah.
It doesn't even, it mentions those, but it doesn't discuss
I
those.
never even
Yeah,
figured
those
out
were
what
the two
existential
that was-
dignity was. I mean, I tried to read that and I just,
Don't they have the problem that they're trying to use the word dignity without using the word nature?
Good question.
Right? If you can't address human nature, you certainly can't address human dignity.
There's a quote, that actually gets to this, right? So,
Do you know what paragraph?
no, this is from St. Thomas. This is Summa Theologica, Secunda Question 64, Article 6. This is sort of where you're going to see the tension, right? And you'll see where the distinction Aquinas makes that is very helpful, that the modern magisterium just is not making at all.